Guys, what I'm going to speak about today is the destination organization, and I'm going to cover a few things. One is I want to give you some of the context that we're seeing out there, right? Not just from an organizational perspective, but also from an us perspective. So from us as individuals, how our expectations are changing about work. I'm going to talk a lot about the changing zeitgeist of organizations. And I'm going to share with you some research that we did over about 18-month period across 100 organizations, where we asked them, what does the future firm look like across a number of different elements? So I'm going to share some of that research with you to get a sense of what organizations need to look and feel like over the next 5 years to be a destination workplace. And finally, I'm going to talk about 3 strategies that we have utilized that will help you to create a destination organization. So that's going to be the kind of the bones of the talk, if you want to call it that. And within that, I'm going to share some perspectives, some of my own opinions, and some extracts from an upcoming book as well. So hopefully you should find this relatively engaging as I go through some of these examples. I think the first thing is that I want to call it is this concept of destination. So for those of you who love looking into dictionaries and kind of stuff like that, I know I do, I'm one of those kind of sad people. A destination really is a place that people want to make a special visit to, or a place worthy of an extended stay. And I think that's a really brilliant word to use when we talk about modern organizations, because as Tony mentioned, we are living in a very, very competitive talent market. And it is up to us as leaders in organizations to create a destination for people that people are attracted to and want to find out more about. And secondly, they have a reason to stay within that organization. So fundamentally for me, I think as leaderships and leaders in organizations, we actually have an opportunity to purposely design organizations that people want to be part of and that helps them on their journey and ours. And there's a couple of important things within that kind of simple definition. One is this idea of design. So I like to tell everybody the first thing is that you're actually all designers, whether you like it or not. So if you're an active designer and you try to create, and really design well, then you're a good designer. If you're not doing any type of design, then you're actually a bad designer. Because I think one of the things we have to recognize is that we have an ability to design organizations in a way that is very attractive to people. So I think that's the first thing to recognize is we are designers and we have an active role in designing our organizations. It can be hard in some instances and can be easy in others, but we have a role there. I think the second element for you is this idea of helping people on their journey. So you've probably heard an awful lot of conversations around leadership and how great leaders really are around, helping their people. And I think great organizations are really about helping people on their journey, because if you help people on their journey, you will ultimately create organizations that people want to be part of. And ultimately we will win because they will help organizations on our journey. So there are those kind of key elements I just want to kind of call out. One is we're all designers. Secondly, organizations' role really is to help people on their journey, and they will then help us on our journey of growth. I want to share a couple of really interesting statistics that I think kind of highlight the zeitgeist of the world of work today. The 51% actually is out of a really, really interesting study that for the first time in the US, millennials are thinking that capitalism is not everything that it's cracked up to be. 51% of people are highlighting socialism as a potential better way of doing things in the US, which is really, really interesting. Up to about 3-4 years ago, everybody highlighted capitalism as the main mode of creating progress, and creating wealth and everything else in between. So we're starting to see in younger generations a changing zeitgeist of what society and work should be. So that's the first thing that's a really, really interesting perspective. And that has all sorts of implications in terms of types of organizations that we create for individuals. It means that those organizations are much more about individuals and people and humans than they are necessarily just about shareholder value. I think the second kind of percentage I want to share with you is 42% of us still think that, still leave organizations because of toxic leaders or poor cultures within the business. Okay, so that's from kind of our own research recently. So that's a really big percentage in terms of people leaving organizations. And from a very recent piece of work we've done, 83% of people surveyed across multiple sectors are considering moving to a better organization. And I'm going to let you think about what better actually means. And kind of hot off the press, really, 80% of HR and talent managers are highlighting difficulties in finding the right type of people to drive their business forward. So some really, really interesting kind of things going on, not just in the world of work, but also in terms of society. As we try to kind of think about what this whole work thing means, and we're dealing with crises like COVID, sustainability crisis. So everything is in a little bit of flux at the moment, and we're starting to question not just work, but also society. And obviously there's an interaction between both. I really love this quote from Forbes Human Resource Council, which kind of highlights the fact that work for many of us has become transactional. And more of us are kind of viewing our careers as something that we are the drivers of. Okay, so and I want to kind of go a little bit deeper behind that. What's going on? So what's going on between us as individuals when it comes to the world of work? Well, you know, from our own work, we've identified that there's a changing expectation of work. I know when I finished college, my father very much said to me, right, Barry, time to get a job. You know, if you're lucky, you'd get a job in a decent organization where you'd have some type of a career pathway. And really all was right with the world, you know, really good, you know, you've got a job, do what you're told, you know, and follow a decent career if you've got a decent organization. I think really what we've seen over the last 20 years is this kind of drive towards work as some kind of meaningful experience and work as some kind of personal transformation. You know, so the expectations of work have changed significantly, and it's not just the younger generations. I think all of us can kind of relate to the fact that we want more from work. And if one thing that the pandemic has kind of had an impact is our reflection on what work is and what work needs to be for us, and what our expectation of work actually is. So I think one of the things I'd like to kind of call out when it comes to this idea of work as a destination is this idea of creating experiences for people. Okay, so it's not actually about creating employment for people anymore. It's actually about creating experiences for people. And the reason I say that is because if you think about where the world of work is going to be in about 7 years' time, I know this has been recorded, so this will probably, you know, people will kind of say, oh, where'd you get those percentages from? But by and large, from our own work, in about 5 to 7 years, about 25% of us, you guys out there included, will be working for ourselves. Okay, 25% potentially of the workforce are going to be freelancers, contractors, one-person organizations, you know, whatever way you want to kind of define that. And there's loads of different employment terms for those type of individuals. So 25% of us are going to be working on our own. That's really important because that means that 25% of the workforce are going to be working with organizations as opposed to necessarily for organizations. So we have to take these kind of things into account. From our own research last year, 1 in 3 of us are doing some kind of a side hustle. So 1 in 3 of us are doing some kind of a side hustle or hobby or something interesting that we're monetizing outside of our core job. Okay, and there's a number of reasons for that. You know, at the lower end of the spectrum, it's because people literally need to make ends meet, you know, and, you know, we talk about wage equality and all that kind of side. And on the other side of the equation, it's that, quite frankly, people aren't necessarily being fulfilled in the job that they're doing, and they're kind of trying to do, you know, other things. Just to give you a really interesting statistic, there are 10 times more books being published now than there were in the same period 15 years ago, as people now can self-publish and create their own books. Just to give you an example of what's happening in terms of this side hustle piece. And I want to call out kind of my own sister, right, who is now a science communicator, very much works on her own as one of those 25% of people, physicist by background, highly intelligent scientist, you know, highly motivated individual in terms of what she does and how she works. She lives in New Zealand. She runs a business globally from New Zealand in a very niche topic called science communication. And the reason I'm calling my sister out as an example is she's an example of what I would call the modern workforce, who have high levels of connectivity. They've almost an infinite access to tools of connection to people. So for example, if you take even one nucleus as the network that we can actually interact with people, the cost of entry into her career is very low. Her expectation is of transforming herself through her own created career. And her niche is now global, so she can kind of sell her wares at a global level very, very simply. And if you compare that to my father and potentially some of your fathers out there, you know, low connectivity, limited access to tools, there's a high cost of entry to create your own role, to create your own career. You know, the expectation was just of having a job. And by and large, you know, what you were going to do, what you could do was very much at a local kind of level. So really think about, we have a few things happening here. One is we've got all this big stuff happening around work. You know, we've got COVID, we've got the sustainability crisis, you know, we've got a changing zeitgeist of work. And then we've got also a number of growing group of individuals that really want an experience when it comes to this idea of work. And then we look at it from an organizational perspective. So if you think about organization almost like a strand of DNA, this is probably what it looked like up until about 15 years ago. That orange represents this idea of playing to win, shareholder value, beat the competition, very hierarchical in many organizations up, to a point. And, you had a situation where there were some organizations talking about things like community and equality. You'd even less organizations talking about things like bringing your whole self to work, about ecosystems and all this kind of stuff. Okay, so it's quite a traditional place to work 15 years ago. I always like to bring in the example of mindfulness here. Mindfulness as a broad concept only really started raising its head in the organizational context about 16, 17 years ago. And at the time, people kind of got, God, that's a bit weird. What's that all about? It seems a little bit kind of new age to us. And now it's a multi-billion-euro organizational business as people recognize the importance of being yourself and being able to manage yourself within an organization. So up until relatively recently, this is our viewpoint when we talked about this thing called work. Now what we're seeing is a much broader spectrum view on what work actually is. We're seeing a bigger focus in things like community, equality, kind of purposeful impact on the environment, or purposeful impact on our communities. We're also seeing a greater focus on what's the meaning of work for people, right? How can we give them the skills that they can regenerate their skill set within the business? And then we're also hearing things like, how do we bring your whole self to work? We're hearing things like, how do we view organizations more as networks and as ecosystems than as just standalone organizations? So now we've got a situation where we've got, people changing expectations. And we've got now organizations recognizing the need to evolve what I would call their core organizational DNA. This DNA that I show you here is closer to what an organization needs to look like than the one I just showed you a moment ago. So that's our kind of target DNA, if we want to call it that, from a destination organization perspective. Now, I'd love to share with you some of our research around what we call the 3 W's of work, right? The workplace, where the work takes place, either physically or virtually. The workforce, so how workforces are changing, how they're, how they're designed. And then finally the work tasks, so the mindsets, the methods, and the tools that deliver the work. So we conducted a research across more than 100 organizations across each of those 3 W's. And we asked them to plot across various spectrums where they feel that the future organization needs to be relevant to the kind of people that we're talking about out there. And this one to kind of share top line some of those results to you, more to give you a sense of the kind of things that you need to be thinking about within your organizations, whether you're in a small organization or a very, very large organization, that you're thinking about these 3 W's and how we can kind of purposely design our spectrums so that they are our destination place to work. So the first one I want to call out, guys, is workforce. I'm not going to go through all of these, as it's quite a large list, as you can kind of see. The gray represents actually where my own organization currently is, and the pink Fs represent where the organization we work with felt that our organizations will need to be over the next 5-year horizon to be relevant to the kind of people that we're speaking about. So if I look at the very, very top one, just as an example, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this as one of the 3 strategies. This idea of moving away from just thinking about, a package, providing a package of supports to an employee, like a salary, some perks and benefits, and maybe a little bit of training, much more toward a total value proposition on the total value that an employee will receive across their career with the organization was a big kind of topic of discussion, and a feeling that that's where things are going to go much more from that perspective. I think you can also kind of see there a big focus on the belonging side to a deep level of inclusion. So, I know many organizations, I'm sure many of you are working on D&I initiatives. This spectrum is very much focused on how do we now utilize all of this diversity in an inclusive environment so that it can help us improve the quality of our projects, improve the quality of our communications, improve the types of products and services that are actually developing to a very diverse and globalized workforce. I think a couple of other really, really interesting ones just to call out are the structural bit. We are seeing definitely a move towards organizations that are much more holacratic, which are much flatter structures. So that means people have a greater sense of meaning within the organizations, and there's not a sense of lots of hierarchy. In a number of sectors, we're seeing a big move towards how do we actually flatten structures so people feel more meaningful in terms of the work that we do. And the last one I just want to call out on the workforce one is this move from just thinking about hard technical skills to much more human and transversal skills, right? I know somebody always says to me, what's the most important skill of the future of work? And it's actually, for me, it's the ability to learn is actually the most important skill. And we often don't think about skills like that when we talk about human skills. We talk about communication, we talk about emotional intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. But they're all skills that can be learned. But we need to have, first of all, the mindset and the skill set to be able to learn in some meaningful way. So that's the workforce piece, just as an example of some of the things that we're kind of changing there. I think when you go to the work task element, and I'm only going to call out a couple of ones here, we are starting to see a big kind of drive towards what we would call agile working practices. So if you look at the third agility one there, we know that in many sectors we have to follow procedures and we have to work within a very restrained and compliant environment. But in terms of how we do that, it's how do we create kind of much more agile ways of working, group ways of working where people, again, feel greater ownership over the kind of tasks that they're doing, okay, is a big kind of thing that a number of the organizations that we spoke to are kind of moving towards. When we talk about this idea of automation, there is definitely a big move towards automating non-value adding tasks as much as possible. There are lots of platforms now out there, there are lots of manufacturing technologies out there that enable us to automate certain things that don't make sense for human beings to necessarily be involved in. And again, that throws up all sorts of interesting conversations around how much automation is enough automation. There's a whole ethical question around there that I'm not going to go into in too much detail, as we will be here for a very, very long time. And then finally, when we talk about the workplace, so this is where work actually takes place. And this is probably the thing that we've talked about a lot, particularly over the COVID period of time. There's a couple of really interesting things I just want to kind of call out here. There's definitely a move towards, what I would call flexibility as the norm. I'm sure you're all aware of that. In some environments, flexibility is difficult. So for me, it's around how can you actually innovate within flexibility beyond a 3 and 2 day split or a 4 and 1 day split and all these kind of conversations. A couple of really interesting things coming out at the moment. About 2 to 3% of new businesses being set up are fully virtual. So they have no kind of physical footprint per se. So that's a really interesting thing that's happening. Second thing that's really interesting is because now organizations are going much more towards a flexible model, we're now seeing companies starting to think, well, what are we going to do with our physical spaces? How can we create new experiences with those physical spaces? What does all that mean? Do we need to get rid of that space, or can we utilize that space for driving greater employee engagement at a personal level, and make that much more of an event when people do actually come together? So there's some of the things we're kind of seeing at a kind of macro level of where organizations feel they need to be in the future over the next 5 years. Now, I want to share with you kind of 3 strategies that I think are really, really important and practical things that we can do over the next 3-month horizon that I always like to say that will improve your ability to attract the right type of talent in a very sustainable fashion and also present your organization in a meaningful way, both within the market and to your current employees. So the first one is work on your story. I hear a lot of crap spoken about storytelling and all this kind of stuff. Everybody seems to be a storyteller today. The most important story for me is actually the story of your organization and how you kind of pull that story together. And what does that all come together to look like to your employees and to potential employees? If you think about it, the world that we're living in today, on average, potential candidates now are looking at about 18 sources and read about 7 to 8 reviews before they even apply to a job. Right? It's an incredible statistic. So when you think about it, people are now thinking about organizations the same way that they think about really important brands to them or really important products that they buy. They're looking at you through that lens. So in order for us to be really, really relevant, we need to really, really nail what I would call a multi-level rich story. Now, I don't know if any of you know what this is, okay? And if you are, then you're a bit of a sci-fi nerd like I am. So, please have conversations with me afterwards. Sci-fi nerds unite. This is actually the original show Bible, it's called, for the Stranger Things TV series. And a show Bible is a document that writers use to pitch their concept of a series to executives, right, within a business. And by and large, those show Bibles have a number of things in there. They have imagery that represents the feeling of the TV series that they're trying to create. They write a lot about the tone of the series they're trying to create. They write a lot about the kind of stories that they're going to tell about the series that they're going to create. And one of the things I'd like you to think about is, if you thought about your current organization, what show Bible would you write? What images would you associate with the company that you currently are and the company that you want to be? What would be the 5 or 6 pages you'd write about your organization in terms of the style of the organization, the tone of the organization, the values of the organization, the stories that people tell about your organization? What would all that look like? What story would you tell? And I always like to say to people, think about the story in terms of what story would you like your employees to tell about you, not just today, but in 5 years' time? Because story is always, as you know, much more about than story. It's actually about the essence, the core of who we are and who we're trying to be. And in many organizations, we haven't taken the time to, number one, identify our current story, and therefore we can't get our story out to potential candidates and even to our own people in terms of who we are as a business and the tone and the culture and the values that we have within the business. And also then where we're trying to get to, so we talk about this idea of change management, it's a bloody horrible phrase. I prefer to use the kind of phrase, what story do we want to be able to tell in 5 years' time? When somebody asks one of our employees our story, what is the story that they're going to use to kind of represent who we are as a business? So I think the first thing is to really recognize the absolute critical importance of the story of your business, the multi-layered nature of that story, and how you can actually try to create that story for your business, both internally and out. It's really, really important thing. Anybody eat Marmite here? I'm sure some of you do. I hate this stuff, okay? But the reason I'm showing you this picture is, one of the things I like to say to all organizations is, all organizations are like Marmite. Not everybody has to love you, right? You're as organizations, you want to attract the types of people that will work within your story, that will work within your environment. You don't need to be old things to old people. You need to identify the real authentic story about yourselves, and they will come. The kind of people that will resonate with your business will come to your business. So the second thing I'd like to remember along with the story time is, it's okay to be Marmite, okay? If anybody out there is relating to the Marmite brand, I'm not using that in any bad way, because you even use that in your own advertising campaigns, right? Some of us love it, some of us don't. And it's exactly the same when it comes to organizations. Not every organization is for every individual. So that's the first thing, the story. The second bit is to develop the value proposition for your people. Now, what the hell is a value proposition? I hear you all ask. Well, a people value proposition is really the total design of the value that people will receive when they join and stay in the business. It's the essence, it's the experience, it's the culture, it's all of the practical stuff that people receive, like their salaries and everything else, all rolled into one. And one of the things that we do a lot of work in the Future Work Institute are what I would call that value canvas, right? So what are all of those different things that people value within an organization? And we have identified 20 in our research, right? So there are 20 things that we can work on that increases the value for people working within an organization. And you notice there's only 2 or 3 there related to remuneration, related to perks and benefits. There are so many other things that we can think about in creating a value proposition that will help attract people and help people stay within the business. So for example, leadership behaviors. Leadership behaviors and leadership quality is one of the biggest things we can work on in creating a destination organization. It's one of the big reasons that people stay and one of the big reasons that people actually leave. Organizational design, how well our businesses are actually organized, regardless if we're 50 people or 1,000 people or 5,000 people. Does our design make sense? And does it actually help people do what they're trying to do, right? Social capital, right? So the amount of interaction I have with my peers and, meaningful interactions, interactions outside of work, they're all really important factors. It's like what we could say. So the second thing I'd like to say to you is that we have a broad canvas here. And all of us are doing things in some of these areas. Some are doing them really well, and some are doing them not as well, and some are doing them relatively okay. But the big thing is that we actually have 20 things that we can play with here. There are 20 things that we can paint our value proposition canvas. And regardless of how small we are or how large we are, we can actually do little things to kind of move some of those things forward. And by doing so, we create a much more rounded value proposition that will attract people and will also retain existing people. Now, here's a really interesting diagram I just want to share with you. This is an example of an organization that we've worked with that plotted their value proposition within one leadership team. When I asked them to plot their value proposition, broke them up into two groups. Both of them had different perspectives on their value proposition. So think about that. The leadership of an organization have a different perspective on what the types of things they're focusing on to create value for their people within their organization. Think about the impact of that in terms of communication, in terms of alignment, in terms of branding out into the marketplace, all the next things that happen if this step isn't fully understood and fully aligned within the business. So I think the second thing I'd like you to really think about is, if you look at that diagram, we shared this diagram after this presentation, where would you plot yourselves on that? What are you strong in terms of your value proposition? How much have you thought about your value proposition? And what are the areas that you are actually really good at today that you want to bring to the next level? Because all of these things will have a meaningful impact, both in terms of how you hire people, how you talk to the people you're going to hire, to how you keep the people in your organization, and how you kind of develop those people within, your organization going forward. So that's the second thing for me. Second thing for me is very much around your value proposition. I think thirdly and finally is this idea of purposefully designing the experience. So I mentioned right at the start of this call that you're actually all designers. Everybody, particularly in the HR and people area, are very much designers. And actually you're more than that, you're experienced designers. So if you think about the way economic things are changing, and this is from a fairly kind of strong book by a guy called Joe Pine, who talks about this idea of the experience economy. We're really in the world of creating experiences now when we talk about the world of work, right? So when you think about it, we're trying to create memories, right? So if you look at that column there that says experiences, we're trying to create memories at a personal level, right? That actually means something to people. Now, there's a couple of really important things to think about when we talk about this idea of you guys as experienced designers. One is, all of a sudden we need to start thinking about how good is our existing experiences, right? How good is our existing experiences and existing journeys within the business? Are there elements of those journeys that we can make more memorable? Are there little things that we can do that would create a little bit more magic for the people that work within our business, or people that are interviewing to our business or going through a journey with us? So that's the big difference when we talk about this idea of you guys as experienced designers. You stand back and you think about each of those elements and how good that experience is. So if you think about a very, very, very simple diagram, I like simple, as you probably guessed from my presentation. Look at kind of even 5 top line moments of truth, right? There's the attraction world, there's the recruitment world, there's the onboarding element, right? There's the engagement element, and there's the developmental element, okay? If you think about those even 5 key things, and if you think as an experienced designer, you say to yourselves, how can we create a bit of magic in our attraction approach, okay? And that might be through story, very simple things. How can we create a little bit of magic through our recruitment process that makes us more memorable to that really good person that we want to kind of attract into our business? And how do we make sure that that's brought forward into our onboarding process? And then how do we make sure, for example, if we're doing a development program, it might only be a 2-day development program, that we make that development program as transformational as we can, and a really memorable experience for the people going on that training program. It does not matter how big or small we are as a business. Looking through the lens of as an experienced designer really means focusing on the little things that we can create a really, really interesting experience for our people, and therefore create a much more destination organization. And just to give you an example, I'm sure some of you know what this is, but these are the little salt and pepper sellers that they use on Virgin Airlines. Okay, so this is a great example of experience design. Okay, many of us have been on airlines where you get your normal bit of salt in a packet. This is literally a little shape of almost like a miniature plane. Okay, and people collect these things now because they become so iconic. People actually take them, and Virgin actually actively asked them to take them, away with them as a memory of their experience, right? Very, very low cost. But what have they done? They've created a very, very simple memory as part of the journey. So one of the things I really like you to think about as the third element is to really think about experience design and thinking about everything that you're currently doing through the lens of the experience and how we can actually create memories for our people. So guys, with that, I'm going to kind of finish my conversation. I'm obviously very, very interested in Q&A. I always like to say simple questions are hard ones. If that's okay, can I just put that out there at the front? But before we do that, I'd just like to kind of highlight our ongoing Employer of Choice series that we're working on with One Nucleus. So we're going to cover in more detail some of the areas I spoke about today, and then other areas adjacent to the destination organization. So the first one will be in 23rd of June, which will be run by colleague Alicia Haggerty, Associate Director and Wellness Lead at the Future Work Institute, on how workplace wellness can enhance your people value proposition. In September, we're going to talk about the storytelling piece and the new employee experience. In October, we're going to talk about leading with purpose. And then in November, we're going to talk about driving employee engagement in new and exciting ways in a hybrid working world. So that's what the kind of series looks like. I'm always very interested in your feedback on other areas that you might like to see as part of those conversations as well. So with that, I think Jasmine and Tony, I am going to stop sharing. Thank you for listening to me for the last kind of 25 minutes. Hopefully I've given you some insights there. I would like you to remember those three areas. Nail your story, really, really important. Develop your value proposition. And then thirdly, really think through the lens of an experienced designer. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry, and apologies that I dropped off. You suggested at the start when we were waiting that I need some props to make my introduction interesting. I hadn't got any props, so I thought I'll just drop off and pretend it was a connection problem. No. I mean, I think it was really interesting insights from my perspective when I talk to our members. And as I was saying, you know, people want to be the best employer they can be, but so does the sector as a whole. But I just wonder, when you talk about getting that value proposition across, and what's the experience if you come and work for my company as opposed to the one next door, has the recruitment process changed to be able to communicate that? Or because we still seem to recruit and we advertise, we shortlist, we interview. How can we evolve that to make it better at assessing the fit? I guess not everyone's going to like you as a workplace, which I think is acceptable. Yep. I think is a good analogy. But just how can we change? How do we communicate it better?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is, and it does come back to my 3 points. So thank you for that, Tony. At least the questions you're asking me, I can just regurgitate what I just said. No, all joking aside, yeah, I think the first thing what we are starting to see is the companies that are kind of moving ahead of the pack, let's say, have really worked on their story both internally and externally. Okay, there's an organization that we work with that are in the rare disease space. And we've developed a whole kind of concept around them, around a rare career. Okay, so they own that idea within their market, and then they've built a set of teams around that kind of positions themselves in a meaningful way. So regardless of your organization, there will be elements of your story that are very, very unique to you guys. Now, I would say one of the things I found working in the broader life sciences space, and you don't mind me saying this, Tony, I hope, is there's a tendency to play a lot to the patient, obviously, which is really, really important. And that's why we're all in this. And I've worked a lot in the kind of life sciences space. But that's not enough. That is not enough. That's only one element of your story. And many people have that story. You also need to get your own elements of the story out. What's the unique elements of the DNA within your organization? Right, and every single company I've worked with guys have that different DNA. So, you know, patient is absolutely central, but you also have to craft your own story around that. So I think that's the first thing for me, Tony, making sure that you stand back and you kind of go, God, you know what actually is our story? Like, what is unique about us, right? Just taking that little bit of extra time. So that's the first thing. The second thing then is you have to kind of filter that story through the people that are, you know, meeting people through your recruitment process or your attraction process, whatever you want to call that. Oftentimes what I find is that I love people on the front line like that, who are hiring managers or talent managers. And I have a number of my colleagues obviously do that from a day-to-day perspective, because they give you a real sense of the individuals and what they're thinking about, what their ask is. So it's almost an iterative process there, right? You need to kind of update your story, but people on the front line in the hiring side need to understand the story so that they can tell the story and people feel part of that story. So that's the second thing. There needs to be this proper program, and it can be, no matter how small you are, it can be a meeting in a room where you say, guys, this is our story, let's talk you through this thing, you know, these are the 5 points we need to get across because we think this is the kind of people that are going track that. That's the first thing that you kind of need to do. I think the second thing for me, I think, is really interesting. We're starting to see this in large organizations in particular, is what is that journey of recruitment, right? Is it just your traditional journey, or are you going to have an element in there that involves, you know, some kind of hands-on challenge, or some kind of brain challenge, you know, or some kind of interactive element that changes the game in terms of that recruitment process and gives you a deeper understanding of those humans, right? Because that's what they are, human beings going through the process. You know, that's the second kind of thing that's really important to me. And the third thing that's really important to me is, genuinely mean this, and what companies, we're seeing a lot of this at the minute, Tony, is getting their hands around that value proposition and really understanding and really kind of going, well, actually, take flexibility as an example. It's a great one because a lot of people talk about it. Many of us aren't in an environment or in a sector where we can do a 3-2-day thing, right? That's fine, absolutely fine. But then we need to kind of think about, what does flexibility mean to us, right? And let me give you an example. We're working with an organization that have very, very limited, you know, opportunities for what I would call 3-2 flexibility or 1-4-day flexibility. But what they have said is, you know what, guys, we're going to do summer days, right? So every Wednesday and Friday, flexibility in our organization means people finish at 3 o'clock, right? That sounds like nothing, right? But in an environment, either a lab or a manufacturing environment, that now is associated with people going, oh, flexibility, right? In our own organization, we give people's birthdays off, right? Flexibility. So it's innovating around flexibility as one thing. So that's just one element of those 20 I showed you around the value proposition. There are other organizations, guys, I've worked with where their culture is just incredible. The level of inclusion and the level of interactivity and collaboration is incredible. But then that doesn't come out in their story because they haven't kind of realized that's that part of the value proposition. So this is not about spending money. It's about standing back and thinking kind of in a more designer focused way around those elements of the journey. Is that a good enough answer, Tony? Because I'm mindful of other questions coming in. I don't want to kind of, you know, you know what I could do, Tony? I could answer one question all the way to the end. So then I won't get another question. So there you go.
But, well, depending on your point of view, you got other questions coming in. So I think it's, I think Catherine asked the one about, are different sectors moving more quickly than others? I think it is important as a life sciences industry, we also learn from good practice in others. We don't just see ourselves as different.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's actually a question, and it comes up a lot. I personally believe life sciences companies, Tony, you're going to smile when I say this, need to move a little bit faster when it comes to the people agenda, because I know you guys have much longer cycles, let's say, in terms of gestation of products, you know, and a lot of risk in some of the areas there. But actually, you know, I think you mentioned at your intro, Tony, this idea of, you know, for me, when we talk about, you know, organizational success, we're actually talking about individual success, you know, people success. So I think definitely I would say life sciences have an opportunity to learn elements of what the tech sector are doing, you know, because they move pretty fast and sometimes they move fast in the wrong direction. So I think it's about kind of, sorry, God, should I say that? It's really about kind of lining up what you guys do really well in the life sciences sector. And for me, that's around a really strong focus on ethics, a really strong focus on process, a really strong focus on compliance, and marrying that with some of the magic of the kind of tech sector and sector. So I definitely think you learn from them. But equally, what I would say to you is, you need a translation service in between. You need to be able to say, oh, actually, there's good stuff here, but based on our world, that's the magic. Bring those two things together, and then you'll get your answer. I don't think it's just, oh, I hate this whole best practice picking, you know, because oftentimes it doesn't work, and it's actually in the wrong context. You know what I mean? So I do think, Catherine, there's a great opportunity for life sciences to, how can I say this in a diplomatic way, speed up by about 15%. Is it okay to say that, Tony? Is that fair?
You can say it.
Yeah. I get thrown under the bus for it. Thanks, Tony. Thanks for your support.
But no, I think it's one of those things, you know, that, because you're so focused on, quite often you look at CVs, and one of the other questions about when you look at the CVs, what's their technical qualifications and experience, and that's how we differentiate. But how do you try and differentiate around aptitude, mindset, and ability to learn? And I guess there's been various attempts at that using all sorts of profiling, but
I mean, I think if I think about it, so if you take, let's say, I take one sector just as an example, and you take any high performance sector, right? So it can be sports, it can be high performing at an artistic level, And it can be maybe something at that area. Generally, you kind of see three overreaching themes, right? There's a few books kind of in and around this kind of area. One is definitely this concept around humility. And humility to me takes in a number of different things. It's standing back with an open mind, with a beginner's mind, and relearning things and, being able to look at things in different ways. So I think humility is a really, really important thing. I think then the kind of second thing for me is this idea of, of being smart, of being switched on, right? And the smart thing to me takes in some of your technical competencies, because look, at the end of the day, in a sector like you guys, you need people with really strong technical competencies to be able to do, what they're about. But it's not just about that. It's also then their smartness in the use of those technical competencies that I think is a really, really important element. You know what I mean? For me, definitely on that side. You know what I mean? And I think then really the kind of the third element for me is drive, hunger, kind of appetite, which again, feels really like nothing. But if, let's say, for example, some of you out there are in a scaling business, right? It's really important that you got people with technical companies, but it's equally important that people have a level of, hunger and focus, that they will work with you in times when times are tough, because times do get tough in scaling businesses. Equally, times get tough in larger businesses, right? So that's important as well. So one thing I would say, Tony, is you're starting to see organizations look at what I would call the other layer, right? The other layer beyond the CV, the other layer beyond X, Y, and Z. I would love a world where we don't talk about CVs anymore. We ask people to bring in their portfolios, to bring us pictures of what they've done. Same way in the art world, where people are live and die by their portfolio. Why is that different? We've done amazing projects as individuals out there in the marketplace. So it's the combination of those. My colleagues in CPL and CPL Life Sciences are way more expert to answer this answer than I am. But I would say that getting that extra layer, going beyond the first layer and thinking about that kind of rounded individual is definitely something that's here to stay. And there's lots of different mechanisms to kind of get to behind that we'll explore, actually, funny enough, Tony, as part of the broader, kind of.
And I think that's the exciting bit, I think, is the way the series unfolds. It kind of takes you on this journey of,
exactly,
you could look at each element and how can you do better in your environment at each of those things. It isn't just there isn't a one size fits all, as you say. This is something you have to adapt to your own context and your own company values and dynamic.
There's a brilliant Japanese concept I'd love you all to really think about, which is shoshin, which is no matter how expert you are, look at everything through a beginner's mindset, right? So, you might have been doing something the same way for 3 months or 6 months or 3 years, but standing back and kind of going, okay, I'm going to look at this now from a beginner's mindset. That's really powerful. And even that step is powerful. You know what I mean? And that can be looking at CVs. It can be looking at how you do hiring. It can be looking at how you do onboarding. Same thing. Stand back. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah. I think one of the other, I think, is also interesting, because I certainly in those early stage and high growth and fast growth companies, Stephanie raises the point of we all try and move being too hierarchical and having a much flatter system, but it kind of inevitably happens. You end up with more layers of decision making, I guess, as you get bigger. Would you have any recommendation for people how to sort of avoid that as best you can? How do you minimize that feeling of hierarchy?
Yeah, it's a pretty good, very educated questions here, Tony. I'll make sure I'm better prepared for the next session. No, I think there's a couple of things, right? There's actually a lot of really interesting businesses out there at the moment that are doing this stuff really well. So I'll draw one of our clients that work with our outsourcing business is a business called Valve, and Valve have what they call a self-managing organization. So what they've done is they've focused a lot around really transparent principles and assumptions of how work is done. And as a result, they haven't needed to build a whole load of kind of hierarchy within that space. So there are exemplar companies out there that you can kind of learn from. By and large, what I can see is that they focus a lot more on the kind of principles and philosophy of how work is done, as opposed to who should be doing the work and who should be reporting to that. So I think one thing is look at some of those organizations and really think about the philosophy and the principles of the organization. And it's one of the reasons I always say a lot when I talk about the future of work. The future of work potentially is a strategic point of differentiation, and it's actually a leader's, it's a CEO thing, right?
Mm.
It's not about where we work. It's not about that. It's about those 3 Ws I mentioned. So one of the roles of a leader for me is to understand what type of organization they're trying to create and work with the HR professional, people professional, to kind of go, actually, do we want a flat organization? What would that mean? Get ahead of that as you grow, as opposed to just kind of going, oh, because we're growing so fast, we need that role as an operations director, or we need this next role, or we need this role. What actually organization are you trying to create? What works well within where you're trying to get to as a business? So that's that element as well. I think the second element I'd say to you as well, guys, and this is a really big one. If you are in an organization that's quite hierarchical, then you're talking about leadership and leadership behaviors. So what leaders are you going to try to create? Are you going to empower leaders that they empower their people to do more than they do? Okay. So for me, there's a very, very simple spectrum, right? One is the spectrum over here says the leader tells you what to do. Right? Over here is the leader enables you to do what to do. Right? There's lots of different versions in between there. So if you have a hierarchical organization, one thing I would say to you is that can be a detrimental impact on keeping people and keeping them engaged in the business. So you then need to look at your leadership approach and how enlightened can you create a set of leaders within that business, and what does your leadership model look like, within that business. So you have lots of places to play, but first of all, you need to ask those kind of questions, and I think that's the big difference for me when we talk about, where we're working, which is a nothing conversation around what type of organizations are we trying to create that would get the best people that would help us drive our business. Two very different questions.
Yeah, I think that's probably something we see in real time playing out is that drive for leadership techniques to change, because those expectations and creating great careers, not just creating jobs, I guess, is what we all try to do.
Yeah.
And one of the things that, and I think it might be Catherine, I think might have mentioned about the group selection process, but for me, it kind of resonates within something like life sciences, the sector we're in. And it's highly networked, it's highly collaborative, and it's highly outsourced a lot of the time. A lot of the gig economy is used because you've got small companies who can't afford the best people to do something on a full-time basis. So you outsource it, or you engage on a consultancy basis. But situated here in Cambridge, and it's such a highly networked and interactive setting.
Yeah.
Are there things we can learn from inside single, probably large organizations, but how we can translate that to a cluster level of websites? How do we make that the best employer to be engaged in that ecosystem? Because obviously a challenge for us as one nucleus firm is to attract good talent to the cluster.
I think Antonio, you're absolutely right. So think about, this is what I always say to people like yourselves, think about your network as a super organization. I'm not saying super as in you're fantastic, right? Super as in, I
could live with that. Go on.
Yeah. Sorry, guys. I don't want to kind of blow smoke, as to say, but think of your network in Cambridge as a super organization, right? And that's a really important point, because a super organization, and if you start thinking about yourself through that lens, then it's the same principles apply. What's your story, right? What's your value proposition? What's the broader sectoral value proposition? And then what's the experiences that you're trying to create as a broader super organization? Okay, so the same principles apply regardless of, ultimately my day job is a chief strategy officer. So people always say, Barry, you're always thinking strategically. But actually, for me, one of the biggest kind of things we need to do is think exactly like what One Nucleus are doing, is to recognize that, all of us as organizations have the ability to create a super organization where the collective will win. Okay, so I get asked a lot about, the kind of what's the real direction of travel, right? Is it me or is it we, right?
Yeah.
So is it all about individuals or is it all about big groups? And the reality is it's about both at the moment, right? And sometimes we move into an environment where it's much more collective. So if you look at some Scandinavian countries, they're much more we economies. If you look at Ireland and the UK, we're much more me economies. Okay, and that's not good or bad. They're just different kind of perspectives. So I think if we can grab the magic of the we and the me, that's where we really can create these super organizations that will really kind of create, what I would call systemic change. Because I think really organizations at an organizational level can really only create transformational change as it relates to themselves. I think organizations together can create systemic change, you know. That's my strategic view anyway. So you can read your Harvard reports as well. They probably agree with me on that, I think, but I disagree with them often. So,
but I think, yeah, they are really important aspects that we have to, the positions we're in now as existing businesses and employees, we need to be thinking about the next generation of what environments are they coming into. And I think it's sort of, there is an onus on us. Yes, we think about sustainability and what future we create, but actually we have to create the future of work, and that's going to be different. And I think
you guys, and I really mean this, it is one of the most interesting dynamic sectors. But it needs the story, it needs the proposition, it needs, you know, it needs all of those things to kind of really get across, you know, what I call the Lego factor, right? You know, everybody says, I would really love to work for Lego, right? That's what I always kind of say, right? You know, even if you don't have played with Lego, most people think, oh, I really want to work with Lego. So what's the Lego factor for, you know, this sector? Like that's I know that's very simple, but you know what I mean? Like it should be always as simple as that.
You know, I think I'm conscious we're coming up to the hour, so I think probably time to wrap it back together. And I think what you've described through that journey this morning, Barry, for me, is what we think about in sort of drug discovery development space. And we talk about in our events, sometimes it's about thinking about what does the product profile look like for a new medicine, and work back from there in terms of what the trial design looks like, what the outreach, and indeed what the story is around it. What's the narrative of why someone's going to prescribe your medicine? You know, why is it worth? So I think I just want to, I'm very grateful on Nuclear's perspective for CPL and yourselves at the Future of Work Institute.
You've died on us there, Tony.
We lost him again. Oh no. We were doing so well. But yeah.
Chadman, I get a feeling that Tony's doing this on purpose for me. So I don't know.
He must be.
Yeah, guys, I've seen a few comments there. Absolutely, guys. Oh, sorry, Tony, you're back. I was about to close the session for you there, Tony.
No, I think my machine seems very keen to close me out, so I'm going to hand over to you to close. I just wanted to say thanks for your collaboration around it, because I think we can do really good things for our members with this. So I'm looking forward to it. And brilliant, over to you to close it out before I disappear again.
Yeah, no, great. And guys, I think I saw some comments there. Absolutely, the slides will be made available, please, just for use within the network, if that's okay. That would be my only proviso at the moment. And secondly, guys, look, we are also very excited about having this collaboration, you know, with One Nucleus. And to be honest, Tony, you know, my feeling on this is I think you're taking a lead in this space, you know, in the UK in particular, and within your own sectoral, you know, super organization, shall we call it. So I thank you for that. And absolutely, guys, you know, you have my details. Please kind of contact us any queries you have. We're always really interested in interaction and collaboration. Slides will be made available. And I really thank you very much for listening to me blab on for 25 minutes. And in another 20 minutes as well, Tony, of questions. So I do apologize for that. But I do thank you very much indeed as well.
Sorry.
Thanks, guys. Good to see you all, and take care.